My name is Lily. I am a social psychologist and a behavioral scientist. I'm in the first year of my PhD at the University of Sheffield in psychology. I have, my supervisor would say, too many research interests, but almost all of them come back to this idea of behavior change. Essentially, that we should try and get people to do less bad behaviors and more good behaviors, which is, I know, like a shopping proposition. But one of the sort of mainly bad behaviors that I've been sort of aiming to discover how we can prevent is prejudice. I'm going to get into a bit more about what that means and what I mean by confrontation as we go through. But first, I want to make sort of a complete tangent. It's not all related. Don't think that it is. I just want to ask everyone to put their hands up if they have blue eyes. Okay, so we're looking at like just over half of the room. That's good to know. I'm going to give some interesting facts about blue eyes and people who have them. First off, everyone who has blue eyes shares a common ancestor. Blue eyes are a genetic mutation, so you can trace your blue eyes back to one person, millions of years ago. This is a reconstruction of Cheddar Man, which is the oldest complete skeleton in Britain, I think. Who is also hypothesized to have had blue eyes, so you will share that ancestor with them. Similarly, if you've ever felt having blue eyes that you are more sensitive to sunlight, that is also a scientific fact, backed up by science. And blue eye irises have less melanin and basically fewer pigments that help to diffractalize. So you are more sensitive to blue light. Those are some hard scientific facts. I'm also going to share some of my personal opinions, such as I think Northern Rail's probably invest in new rolling stock. Going to share some of my personal opinions about blue eyes and people who have them. The first is, because blue eyes are like a mutation, I just don't think we should be letting them have kids. They're never gonna have like a solid, good life prospect if they're living with this deformity their whole life. And secondly, I just don't think we can trust people with blue eyes, because they're always wearing sunglasses to hide who they are. So can we really allow them to be in government, for example, if we can't trust them? It was related, I lied. That is prejudice, generally a bad thing. As a note, I don't actually hold those opinions. I have blue eyes, my mum has blue eyes. But that's hopefully a sort of very low-key, low-stakes example of prejudice. When I say prejudice as well, to be clear, what I actually mean is implicit bias, which is essentially a broad concept that includes prejudice, stereotyping, discrimination. When we say intergroup bias, what you mean is treating someone differently because of their membership in a group that is different to the other, valuing them less because of that group membership. This is generally a bad thing, obviously from a sort of moral perspective that we're sort of taught, in reception, not to treat people differently. But there's also lots of scientific evidence that intergroup bias and prejudice, as I'm going to refer to it from now on, for the sake of saving a few words, is harmful. So there's lots of evidence that prejudice is related to poorer mental health and poorer physical health, and also that it impacts your access to employment, education, housing, so, all the things you sort of need to have a decent life. And it's also pretty widespread. So just as about half the people in this room just experience anti-blue eye prejudice, about 42% of people in the UK in 2018 experienced discrimination based on a protected characteristic. So this is a very broad, prevalent problem, which obviously goes back very far. Blue-eyed people aren't actually discriminated against, but if we talk about race, sex, faith, and all these other characteristics, there is a very long history of that prejudice. So that sort of gets us to what can we do about it? How can we reduce it? We have recognized it as a problem. How can we stop it existing? And there's been a sort of few suggestions raised about how to do this. The first is one that you might have come across before. You might even participated in it if you have worked in like an institution or workplace. And that's called implicit or unconscious bias training. Essentially, that is getting you to reckon with biases you hold about other people that you might not even be conscious about. Sort of like initial reactions to people from different groups. There's also intergroup contact, which is the idea that if you meet with, have a conversation with, have a relationship with someone in a different group than your own, your prejudice against that person will decrease. You're having more biases against them, sort of disproving in real time. These are, broadly speaking, good theories, but they do have some drawbacks. Firstly, for implicit bias training, you need resources to be able to do that. You need money to pay for a course or a facilitator. You need time for your employees to be able to go and do that. And you need institutional support. You can't be doing this sort of bias training if the company you work for doesn't recognize that prejudice is an issue. That's become particularly pertinent with the figures generally coming in the world, and so it's a pretty big drawback. Similarly, for intergroup contact, these horrible little bricks that we carry around with us have sort of upended a lot of our theories about social communication and interaction. And it sort of seems like when you interact with someone online, on social media, you're not getting that same level of interaction that you would in person. And so that reduction in bias doesn't seem to be happening. There's also mixed evidence, but it's certainly being challenged that it's always positive. Increasingly as well, if you're like designing an intervention that's using either of those, by necessity, they sort of have to be top-down interventions. So someone at the top decides something needs to be done, and then they do it. It requires that buy-in from the top. Conversely, as you might have guessed from the title of the talk, confrontation is an alternative method of reducing prejudice. Now, I'm not a massive fan of the term confrontation because I think it sort of elicits like ideas of hostility and aggression, which isn't necessarily what it is. When I say confrontation, what I'm sort of describing is best described by another term, which I'm not going to use because it's just longer, but it's bystander anti-prejudice. This idea of, as a bystander in a situation, being actively anti-prejudiced and challenging that prejudice as it happens. In the sort of like broadest possible terms, it's seeing something prejudice happened or something prejudice being said. It's telling a person who said or done that what they've done is prejudice and you don't approve of it. So to take that back to our example of eye color. What an example of confrontation might look like for that is saying, hey, you said that people with blue eyes shouldn't be able to have children because of this genetic abnormality. That's kind of a misunderstanding of what a genetic mutation is. And also, it's not really your choice if they have kids. That's one example with a confrontation. Similarly, you could react to the other point about sunglasses and trustworthiness by saying, yes, a lot of people with blue eyes wear sunglasses. They're not doing it to hide who they are. They're doing it to hide from the sun and protect their eyesight. It's challenging those misconceptions and pointing out that what's been said is prejudice. There's also sort of different types of confrontation, how it can be worded, how it can be sort of expressed. So the first one of those is the publicness of the confrontation. What I described just then is sort of calling out. Someone says something prejudice, and then you call them out in the moment, usually in front of other people, saying that what they say is prejudice. An alternative method is called calling in prejudice. So this is basically wait for that interaction to end, taking that person aside, and then doing that confrontation there in private. So that can allow the confronter to sort of gather their thoughts and feelings, and also if they're worried about the person confronting acting negatively, they can sort of contain that. Similarly, there's the different sort of styles of confrontation. So you can confront in an educational way, where you explain that what someone has said is prejudiced. You explain why it's harmful. You can confront in an aggressive way, a confrontational way, sort of closer to that sort of conception from the start, where you're sort of trying to win an argument in an argumentative way. You can do a help-seeking confrontation, where, for example, you seek out a person of authority, report to them. You can do an empathetic confrontation, where you make it clear to that person how they've made you feel negatively, to try and get them to empathize with you. And you could also do a sort of humorous or comedic confrontation, where you make a joke at the expense of the prejudice comment, or you sort of play it off as like, okay, that's a bit steep, don't you think? We're just here having bites. You don't have to bring your prejudices into it. There has been lots of ideas about whether any of these styles are more or less effective than others. And a lot of the data has sort of been mixed, to say the least. There's been a lot of like single studies that have found something that not like a massive amount of certainty. And then there's also the bigger question, right? Is confrontation actually effective at all? It is a matter of us splitting hairs about what kind of confrontation is more effective if none of them are actually effective. Thankfully, someone answered this question. That someone is me, and a bunch of my colleagues. I'm sorry for the very boring slide, but this is my first published paper, so you gotta look at it for a bit. Essentially, what we did was a meta-analysis. So that is taking a bunch of existing studies, bringing them all together and saying, okay, so individually, study A found this, study B found that, study C found that. But if we bring them all together, what do the studies as a whole say? What we found was, generally, yeah, confrontation is effective at reducing prejudice. Very good, the research is important and useful. It was a significant medium-sized affair, which means that it was significant, so it was effective, and it was medium-sized, so it was like pretty effective. We also then wanted to look at those styles that I mentioned. Does the style of confrontation impact how effective it is? Is an empathetic or an educational confrontation more effective at reducing prejudice than an argumentative one? Similarly, if you're confronting racism versus sexism, does that impact how effective confrontation is as a prejudice reduction tool? And the answer was there wasn't actually that many differences. So the one thing that you did found is that when you were sort of like confronting someone who was endorsing or using stereotypes, that was more effective. But that was essentially because most of the studies you look at stereotype use. In terms of sexism versus racism, in terms of whether the confronter was the person who experienced the prejudice or someone different, there was very little difference. Broadly speaking, it just works. A sort of side note about this paper, and also most of the research here, it falls into a big bias and sort of methodological issue in social psychology, which is that it was a weird sample, and I'm not insulting them. It means they're from Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic countries, so largely the US, the UK, Europe. Although given the events of the past year, I don't know if maybe we should drop a D from that, given the US, but regardless, that's something to point to consider, that this is certainly applicable in the West, outside, maybe not so much. That's my name. And that sort of leads us to the point of, so why isn't it happening? If prejudice is really common, and it is, again, about 42% of people in the UK, and confrontation is effective, which it is, why aren't we drowning confrontation, right? An additional point, confrontation is very effective at also mitigating some of those negative effects I mentioned at the start. So if you have experienced prejudice and you confront that prejudice, it can help lead to sort of a dampening of those negative mental health effects and stuff like that. So all of that good information and bad information about the amount of prejudice that exists, why isn't confrontation happening everywhere? As you might have guessed, it's because we don't live in a perfect world. Of course we don't. That's why prejudice exists. There are things that can get in the way of someone confronting, someone making that behavior happen. So I want you to visualize this road to confrontation. Very visual. We have our good friend here, E.I. Spander, and they want to go and tackle some confrontation just over that bridge at the end of the road. They're making their way down, about to go and tell someone that what they said is prejudiced. And all of a sudden, there's a big barrier in their way. Something's stopping them from doing that behavior. In the studies that I've been doing, the spheres that I move in, we use something called the COM-B model, which is an acronym. We love acronyms in psychology. For the three things, C, the O, and the M, that can change behavior, the B. So, C, capability. Is the bystander capable of confronting? Do they feel that they can recognize prejudice when they see it and therefore confront it? O, opportunity. Does the bystander have the opportunity to confront prejudice? Is there prejudice happening around them? If they're very lucky and there isn't, they won't be able to confront it because it's not there. And then M, motivation. Does the bystander feel that confronting is a positive behavior to do? Do they feel motivated to do it? If they believe that confrontation is not effective at reducing prejudice, why would they put themselves through all that work? Those are obviously issues we want people to confront, and that can stop them from doing it. But, conversely, if there were things that stop behavior, there must also be things that can help behavior. We call these drivers. So this is a Lamborghini, which my boyfriend who likes cars ensures me is still very cool, to represent the drivers to behavior. So we can use that same three aspects. Capability. What if the bystander does feel capable to confront prejudice? What if they can identify it when it's happening? Opportunity. This is kind of actually quite a negative word. Is the bystander surrounded by prejudice all the time and therefore has ample opportunity to confront it? And motivation. I'm just spitballing here, but perhaps the bystander attends a really persuasive kind of science talk about how confrontation is effective at reducing prejudice and therefore feels really motivated to do it. If that's the case, then the bystander need to get in that car, drive past the barriers, and be on their way to the road to confrontation. But are those barriers to drivers always the same? That's a big question. What if, for the sake of argument, there you go, thank you. What if, for the sake of argument, the type of prejudice that the bystander wants to confront is transphobia? Would the barriers and drivers be different for the bystander if the bystander was a trans person or a cis person? People being prejudiced against or not? That is what we attempted to answer in a different study, where we basically asked transgender people and cisgender people, what is stopping and what is helping you confront transphobia? We got a bunch of answers, surprisingly. So most of the answers were pretty consistent among both crews. The idea that confrontation might not always be safe, but it might be a threat to your safety, particularly if you're confronting someone you don't know, particularly if you're from a minoritized background. Secondly, mental considerations, the fact that there is a mental toll to confronting. It's not all roses, it can be quite mentally taxing. The idea that transphobia specifically often goes unpunished. So you might go through all of this work confronting someone, and then they get told by their boss, actually, it's funny. The idea of not blocking the votes, that you're sort of like bringing on a lot of social consequences by not sort of like sticking with the majority view. This is a very funny graphic, by the way, back from like 100 years ago, when it was the Democrats who were going pro-tariff. Then in terms of things that helped people confront, the idea that people didn't know transphobia when they see it. They know that when something sort of like crosses a line into prejudice. And this idea that you should speak up for the change you want to see, that good things will happen unless you speak up for them. But there was one really interesting factor. One thing where the two groups did not agree whether it was a driver or a barrier. And that was society, or specifically social factors. Does society as a whole promote the confrontation of transphobia? Trans people said no, and cis people said yes, which I think is very interesting. Now, this is from 2020. A lot of things are happening since then. So potentially those things have changed. But what it shows is what can count as a helping or a hindering factor is very dependent on the person involved. It's very dependent on whether they're part of the group being prejudiced against, for example. So where does that leave us? I've sort of talked at you for, frankly, far too long. What prejudice is, why it's bad from a scientific perspective as well as a moral one, and so the things we can do to mitigate it, such as confrontation. But then I've also told you, confrontation is pretty hard. There can be lots of difficulties in getting yourself to confront. I'm not going to do that. That would be pretty negative. So I do have one more point. The thing that I would say is confronting prejudice is pretty much always worthwhile. And here's why. Obviously, there is the data that shows that confrontation is effective. But there's one more point. While I've been talking to you, there's sort of been an insinuation, right, that when we're confronting prejudice and reducing prejudice, the person whose prejudice we're reducing is the person who said something prejudiced, the person we're confronting. But that's not the only person whose biases are being challenged, especially if you're falling out in a public setting. You are setting the stage, the scene, the social environment for all of the other people who witness that confrontation. So you might not get through to the person who you're confronting, but the people who witness that, who can internalize, oh, actually what they've said is prejudice, and it's typically not condoned about it, it's not socially accepted, you're reaching those people. You're setting a social standard. You are saying those views are not worthy of respect in a democratic society. And you're saying, I'm going to help build an anti-prejudice society by calling out prejudice. So I'm not going to be prescriptive and say, everyone come up that door right now and start confronting prejudice. But I'm saying, if you want to confront, and your biggest sort of like barrier for doing so, that motivation factor is thinking it's not going to work, it probably will. So if that's stopping you, stop letting. Thank you very much for listening. Feel free to email me later as well if you want to ask questions if we can't get in now. And there's the references there. Otherwise, I'm very happy to answer questions. Thank you.